The chilling silence that often descended upon a crucial witness in the wake of federal intervention was, for many, a stark and unsettling reality of America's turbulent early 20th century. How many individuals, once poised to testify against powerful criminal syndicates or their political enablers, simply evaporated from the public eye, their voices muted, their testimonies never heard in courtrooms where justice was often a precarious tightrope walk. The records, often sparse and deliberately vague, hint at a pervasive quietude, a cessation of information flow that followed the arrival of the federal agents, the G-men, as they were colloquially known. This phenomenon, while rarely acknowledged openly by official channels, left an indelible mark on the public consciousness, shaping the very definition of justice in an era defined by speakeasies, Tommy guns, and the shadowy dance between crime and an increasingly powerful federal government. To comprehend this unsettling pattern, one must first immerse oneself in the volatile crucible of America during the Prohibition era, a period stretching from the ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1919 until its repeal in 1933. This was not merely a legislative experiment. It was a profound societal convulsion that fundamentally reshaped the nation's criminal landscape. The outlawing of alcohol, intended to usher in an era of moral uprightness and civic virtue, instead birthed an unprecedented explosion of organized crime. From the bustling metropolises of New York and Chicago to the dusty backroads of the South, illicit distilleries and hidden gin joints flourished, fueled by an insatiable public demand. Gangsters, once confined to local rackets, now commanded vast, sophisticated networks, controlling production, distribution, and protection. Figures like Al Capone, Bugs Moran, and Dutch Schultz became household names, their exploits sensationalized by a hungry press, their power extending far beyond the alleys and into the halls of city councils and state legislatures. Local law enforcement, often underfunded, understaffed, and frequently compromised by corruption, found itself overwhelmed. Police chiefs watched as their officers, earning meager wages, were offered fortunes by bootlegging syndicates to turn a blind eye, or worse, to actively facilitate their operations. Sheriffs in rural counties, faced with violent moonshiners and rum runners, simply lacked the resources or the reach to effectively combat these burgeoning criminal empires. This vacuum of effective local authority presented a unique opportunity, and indeed a necessity, for the federal government to assert its jurisdiction. The Bureau of Investigation, a relatively young and largely unknown agency, found its mission expanding dramatically beyond its initial mandate of investigating white-collar crime and anarchist plots. Under the formidable leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, who took the helm in 1924, the Bureau began its transformation into the Federal Bureau of Investigation, an organization synonymous with uncompromising federal authority. The early G-men were a different breed from the local beat cops. They were, in theory, incorruptible, driven by a national mandate, and increasingly armed with resources and legal avenues that local police often lacked. Yet, their methods were, by modern standards, rudimentary and often pushed the boundaries of legality. Without the sophisticated forensic techniques of later decades, investigations relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, informants, and confessions. This reliance created a critical vulnerability: the witness. For every ledger seized, every hidden still discovered, there was a need for someone to stand in court and attest to the facts, to point the finger, to confirm the illicit dealings. But in a world where a $5 bill could buy silence and a bullet could ensure permanent discretion, finding and retaining such witnesses became a perilous endeavor, a high-stakes gamble with human lives. Consider the plight of a small-time saloon keeper, perhaps a man named Arthur Higgins, who operated a seemingly legitimate establishment on the edges of a Chicago neighborhood in the late 1920s. Higgins knew the local Capone enforcers by name, had perhaps even served them drinks, and certainly paid the regular protection money that ensured his continued, albeit illegal, operation. One day, federal agents, perhaps tipped off by a rival gang or an aggrieved former employee, raided his establishment. They found not only illegal liquor, but ledgers detailing the vast network of payoffs and distribution routes, implicating not just the foot soldiers but also the shadowy figures higher up the ladder. Higgins, initially terrified, was cornered. He could face federal charges, a lengthy prison sentence, and the probable ruin of his family, or he could cooperate. The G-men, dressed in their characteristic dark suits and fedoras, offered him a deal: testimony in exchange for leniency, perhaps even a new life. What choice did a man like Higgins truly have when faced with such an ultimatum? The implicit threat of federal prosecution loomed large, but equally terrifying was the unspoken promise of brutal retaliation from the syndicate if he dared to speak. This was the grim calculus facing many potential witnesses. The Bureau, in its nascent stages, had no formal witness protection program as we understand it today. Its methods of safeguarding crucial testimony were often ad hoc and improvisational, ranging from placing witnesses in remote anonymous hotels under armed guard to simply advising them to leave town. Some individuals were held as material witnesses in federal facilities, sometimes for extended periods, essentially incarcerated to ensure their availability and, crucially, their silence from external influences, both criminal and journalistic. This practice, while legally sanctioned, blurred the lines between protection and detention, raising questions about individual liberties. A witness, once plucked from their life by federal agents, often found themselves in a peculiar sort of limbo, disconnected from family, livelihood, and community. Their testimony became the sole currency defining their immediate future, a fragile shield against both state prosecution and gangster retribution. Historians grapple with the true nature of these vanished witnesses. Was it always the overt threat of gangster violence that silenced them? Or did the heavy hand of the federal government, eager to secure convictions and bolster its reputation, play a more nuanced, perhaps even coercive, role in their disappearance from public view? One prevailing interpretation suggests that the vast majority of witnesses who went quiet did so out of sheer terror of retaliation from criminal organizations. The syndicates of the era were notorious for their ruthlessness. Their methods of silencing opposition or betrayal were swift, brutal, and often public, serving as a chilling deterrent to others. A bullet in the back of the head, a cement overcoat in the river, or a mysterious disappearance were not uncommon fates for those who dared to cross them. The federal agents, despite their efforts, could not always guarantee absolute safety, especially not in an era devoid of 24-hour surveillance technology or hardened safe houses. The psychological toll on a person caught between the federal hammer and the criminal anvil was immense, often leading to a voluntary retreat into anonymity, a desperate bid for survival. Another interpretation, however, hints at a more proactive, if not overtly sinister, role played by the federal authorities themselves. It posits that the Bureau, in its zealous pursuit of public enemies and high-profile convictions, was not above employing methods that effectively removed witnesses from the public sphere, not just for protection, but sometimes to control narratives, prevent embarrassing disclosures, or even to secure testimony through less than gentle persuasion. By holding witnesses indefinitely, by isolating them from legal counsel or public scrutiny, federal agents gained immense leverage. Was it possible that some witnesses were simply persuaded to change their story or to retract it altogether if their testimony became problematic or less useful to the federal case? The goal was to close cases, to build a reputation, and in the nascent years of the FBI, the ends sometimes justified means that would be deemed unacceptable today. The true motives of a person choosing to disappear, or being disappeared, into the quiet federal maw remain shrouded in the opaque records of an era less concerned with transparency than with results. So, when the G-men arrived, their dark sedans pulling up to a dusty storefront or a bustling apartment building, a tremor often ran through the community. Not just a tremor of fear for the criminals, but for anyone who might have seen something, heard something, or, God forbid, known something. For these individuals, the line between justice and peril blurred into an indistinguishable haze. They were caught in a violent, high-stakes drama, their lives forever altered by the demands of the state and the threats of the underworld. How many unsung heroes and forgotten victims simply vanished into the annals of unrecorded history? their potential testimonies echoing unheard in the deafening silence that followed a federal investigation. The expanding reach of federal law enforcement during the 1930s, particularly in the wake of the repeal of prohibition and the burgeoning public enemy era, only intensified the fraught relationship between authorities and potential witnesses. With alcohol once again legal, the attention of the Bureau of Investigation shifted dramatically towards notorious bank robbers, kidnappers, and interstate criminals who had flourished in the preceding decade. Figures like John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Machine Gun Kelly became the new face of federal targets. Their exploits splashed across newspaper front pages and projected onto flickering newsreels. The public, weary of rampant crime and nostalgic for order, clamored for decisive action, and J. Edgar Hoover, with his keen understanding of public relations, was eager to deliver. He cultivated the image of the G-Man, incorruptible, efficient, and relentlessly effective, a stark contrast to the often maligned local police. This era saw the Bureau granted wider powers, including the authority to make arrests and carry firearms, transforming them from investigators into armed agents on the front lines of a declared war on crime. This heightened focus on high-profile criminals brought with it an increased premium on witness testimony. Bank tellers, farmers who had seen a getaway car, innkeepers who had rented rooms to fugitives. These ordinary citizens suddenly found themselves in possession of vital information, their anonymity shattered. But the criminals of this era were no less ruthless than the bootleggers. Dillinger, for example, was known for his extreme violence and daring escapes. His associates were equally dangerous. Witnesses against such individuals faced not just intimidation, but credible threats of bodily harm or even death. The stakes were impossibly high for those caught in the crossfire. Federal agents, therefore, developed more sophisticated, though still nascent, strategies to manage these crucial human assets. The concept of moving witnesses, providing them with new identities, or placing them under continuous guard gained traction, albeit without the formal legislative framework or budget of later decades. These were desperate measures born of desperate times, often implemented without clear guidelines or precedents. Imagine the quiet terror of Clara Henderson, a switchboard operator in a small Midwestern town in 1933. From her perch, she had overheard fragmented conversations, hushed voices, and coded messages passing through her wires, indicating the presence of a notorious gang in a nearby hideout. When the federal agents arrived, sharp-suited and grim-faced, they did not merely ask for her cooperation, they virtually commandeered her life. Her small apartment was deemed unsafe, her daily routine too predictable. She was whisked away, not to a luxurious safe house, but to a series of nondescript hotel rooms, often several towns away, guarded by agents who themselves looked perpetually weary and armed. Her family was given vague explanations, told she was away on business or visiting relatives. For weeks, perhaps months, Clara lived in a gilded cage, her world shrunk to the four walls of a temporary room, her only companions the silent, watchful G-men. Her testimony was precious, a key that could unlock a major federal case, and thus, her freedom became secondary to the demands of the investigation. The isolation, the constant fear of being discovered, and the sheer uncertainty of her future weighed heavily, turning her into a living ghost, a woman erased from her own life. The consequences of these practices rippled through society in complex ways. On one hand, the aggressive pursuit of notorious criminals, often aided by courageous if anonymous witnesses, did lead to significant victories for federal law enforcement. The public's confidence in the G-men soared, solidifying the Bureau's image as the nation's premier crime-fighting agency. This, in turn, fueled public support for expanded federal powers and budgets. On the other hand, the often unconventional methods employed raised significant concerns about civil liberties, particularly for those witnesses who found themselves essentially detained, their movements restricted, and their lives put on hold without formal charges or transparent legal process. The line between protecting a witness and coercing them, between offering them a new life and forcing them into hiding, became increasingly blurry. For every criminal brought to justice, there was potentially a witness whose life had been irrevocably altered. Their previous existence dissolved into the quietude demanded by federal necessity. The historical debate surrounding these vanished witnesses continues to evolve. One perspective suggests that such extreme measures, while uncomfortable by today's standards, were regrettably necessary given the unprecedented challenge posed by organized crime and the lack of robust legal frameworks for witness protection. In an era where local authorities were often outmatched and corrupt, and where criminal syndicates wielded immense power, the federal government was seen as the last bastion of order. Removing a witness from their environment, even forcibly, was viewed as a pragmatic, albeit harsh choice to ensure their survival and the success of the prosecution. It was a trade-off, perhaps, of individual liberty for the greater good of public safety. However, another school of thought presents a more critical view. It argues that the Bureau, in its drive for efficiency and public acclaim, sometimes overstepped its bounds, creating a climate where individual rights were secondary to institutional goals. The lack of independent oversight for witness handling, the prolonged detentions, and the potential for psychological manipulation meant that the power dynamics heavily favored the federal agents. Witnesses might have been protected from physical harm, but their autonomy, their social connections, and their sense of self were often profoundly compromised. These critics suggest that the silence that followed the G-men's arrival was not always a testament to successful protection, but sometimes to an effective, if ethically dubious, form of control, where the witness's narrative was curated and their public presence nullified to serve the specific needs of the state. It raises the unsettling question of whether some vanished witnesses were not just protected, but also silenced in ways that suited the federal agenda, their full stories never emerging. The legacy of this period is complex, reflecting a nation grappling with the fundamental tension between security and freedom. The G-men established a formidable federal presence, bringing a semblance of order to a chaotic criminal landscape. Yet, their methods, born of necessity and evolving without clear precedent, left a lingering shadow over the fates of those ordinary people who, by chance or circumstance, became privy to the secrets of the underworld. Their stories, often untold and unrecorded, represent a quieter, more ambiguous aspect of American justice. The questions remain: at what cost did these cases go quiet?